My featured guest today for Roqe the Experts is a well-known Iranian-Canadian physician in the area of medical aesthetics. Dr. Amir Rouzati is the founder and director of Skin Beauty MD, one of the first and best-known medical practices in Toronto, focusing on cosmetic, injectable, and non-surgical medical aesthetics. Dr. Rouzati was born in Isfahan. He moved to the West with his family in 1985 at the age of 10. At the time, he was in a wheelchair with a severe inflammatory condition. That experience as a patient and his full recovery was a turning point, he says, that led him to a lifelong passion for working in the medical field. He overcame his illness, attended the University of Toronto with an honors degree in immunology, went to the University of Manitoba Medical School, and completed family practice residency at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Rouzati is now a recognized physician with over 15 years of experience in the medical aesthetics. Dr. Amir Rouzati joins me in the Roqe studio today. Hello, sir.
Hi, Gian. Pleasure to be here.
Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
In chatting with you and seeing you in and around Toronto over the years, it's clear that you really have a passion for what you do, for the medical profession, for the kind of work you do. Is that performative, or are you actually this enthusiastic about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I first started, it might have been my third patient in cosmetic treatment. She didn't know she was the third patient, but she said she knew I was starting. She said, "Dr. Rouzati, I think you're going to be very successful at this." And I said, "Why do you say that?" And she said, "Because I can really tell that you have a deep passion for this." I think when you've been in the field for as long as I have, and through some of the dark times and the challenges as well, when you're trying to start an enterprise and be innovative, passion goes a long way to get you over the challenges.
How far does that go? Are you excited to get to work every day, or would that be too much?
I can tell you that I was thinking about the fact that having done this for about 15 years, I'm still not bored of it. And so, yes, to a large extent, I don't, the Monday morning blues where, people don't want to show up at work. I don't really experience that.
Why are you not bored of it?
I think it's still so impactful. Sometimes we talk about Botox, dermal fillers as if they're minor treatments, but really we forget the fact that some of the results are nearly the type of results that you would accomplish with surgery. And in fact, 20 years ago, if you wanted to lift your eyebrows a little bit, or if you wanted to tighten your skin a little bit, the only solution would have been surgery. And so here we are with this wonderful advance where in the right hands, you can get very impactful results.
Yours was, by the way, I'm very self-conscious during this interview that my eyebrows should be lifted. I keep thinking of things that I'm going to need to change. Yours was one of the first medical aesthetics clinics in Toronto. You started in 2006, mainly with the Botox procedure. Just as we start this off, let's call it, you've become very successful. Did you have any inkling that your business would grow this way?
I had a vision about it for sure, but I was in the first wave of physicians that crossed over from primary care practice to non-surgical injections. Prior to that, this was more in the domain of plastic surgeons or maybe dermatologists. It took a lot of energy. When I look back, it just took an immense amount of energy for the practice to be where it is today. And we've had, lasting power, and we continue to innovate and improve and increase what we're doing. And I still feel those excitement juices. I'm still, if you talk to my wife, she'll say on the weekends, I'm still thinking of ways to improve and increase the impact that we can deliver.
All right. So I want to get into a discussion around changing perceptions of medical aesthetics. We'll do that in a little bit. But just to dip our toes into the waters around Botox, it really feels like Botox was something people were much more closeted about just a few years ago. And that's really not the case anymore. Would that be true in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you from personal experience, a few years ago, if I showed up at a Iranian function in Toronto, a lot of people would try to avoid me because they would be worried that if they say hi to me, their secret is out. Whereas now it's the exact opposite. I was just at a function over the weekend, and at the table, one of the individuals at the table was a patient of mine, and she was proudly telling her friend, "This is where I go for my treatment." So that really,
and that wouldn't have happened a decade ago.
No. Things are different now,
Yeah, I mean, not only are things different now, people who do what you do have become celebrities. I mean, there's Netflix shows, there's a whole industry around celebrating the surgeons who do this kind of work, right?
Yeah, you're right. And I still remember, a few years ago, the first time that, somebody just approached me in the mall and said, I follow your Instagram, and I think that's the power of social media, YouTube, and yes, there's definitely a celebrity culture around it. It's also maybe one of the more challenging aspects of running this type of practice is you not only have to be a great physician, a great technician, be able to clinically deliver the results, but you have to be very comfortable, marketing yourself in that domain, and that's increasingly challenging to do.
Just anecdotally, is there ever a situation where you've done something where it doesn't work it doesn't work out so well, and then you see them at the gala and you go, "Oh man, I could have done a better job," or "I hope they don't say anything," or
when I first started in this field, a mentor of mine said, the mark of a good physician in aesthetics is how many procedures they decline to do, meaning how many no's you say. And so we're very careful in the consultation to make sure that we're on the same page, with the patient. And I always keep that in the back of my mind. It's easy in a busy practice to get revved up and want to convert every consultation to a treatment. But I always remember, it's the patient selection. It's how many no's you say at the end of the day.
I want to pick up on that a little later as well. But just around this changing perceptions and the closeted nature of, as I called it, of how people dealt with doing Botox in the past. You've pointed out something interesting as an Iranian, which is that we have these constructions or stereotypes about the West being ahead of the curve and, the East or somewhere like Iran playing catch up the whole time. But in this space, in Iran, 2 decades ago or 15 years ago, it was much more commonplace to be open about doing this kind of work and not have any shame and to discuss it and to want to find a good surgeon, etc., than it has been here, right?
Absolutely. You've heard that in Iran, it's almost like a status symbol to show that you're just post-rhinoplasty and wear the bandage. Same thing with injections. In fact, one of the ways I got my start was on my travels to Iran, back in 2004, 2005, and I started to see, how much people are starting to get into these types of procedures. And at that time, I would say, from a general community level, there was much more excitement in Iran for doing these procedures than here. So I learned that on my trips there, that this is a up and coming thing. And so I came back to Canada, with that mindset. So always nice to visit different cultures, nice to visit the home country as well. And you can always, pick up certain trends earlier there. I'm still amazed in Iran, like the whole Instagram culture in many ways is much more forward than here.
Ahead of the curve.
Ahead of the curve. Like my grandmother is, in her 80s and she'll be on Instagram all day. Whereas here, that may not necessarily be the case in that age category.
I'd forgotten this, but I actually know someone, she's in her 30s, who, in order to get any medical aesthetic stuff done, always goes to Iran for it. And it reminds me that people who do like hair replacement stuff go to Turkey sometimes. Like, is that true that people would go from Toronto to Iran to get Botox done? Or?
Not so much for injectables, because the one issue is sometimes for surgical procedures there's obviously a cost advantage to going overseas, Turkey or Iran, and in injectables it won't quite be the same cost advantage. But the other thing is, Iran can also have a culture of being a little bit extremists with certain things, and so that can apply to cosmetic injections as well. So, my experience or observation going on those travels to Iran back in 2004, 2005, different from the last time I was in Iran, which is about 5 years ago, where I frankly felt that
you mean somebody who could, something that people couldn't get done here because nobody would do it for them, they'll do it in Iran. Is that what you mean?
At that time?
No, now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, yes, in Iran, as far as medical aesthetics goes, you can pretty much get any service that you request. Whereas here, some of the, a lot more physicians would be comfortable saying no to a specific request or specific procedure. So Iran, my observation last time I was there, I haven't been there for a few years, but there was a tendency to look overdone, and that goes against my philosophy as far as medical aesthetics.
Speaking of this philosophy, which you've already referenced a couple of times, you've said you take pride in your clinic maintaining a reputation of excellence in medical cosmetic injections, but also being known for integrity in what you do. So what does that mean? What does integrity mean in this space that you work in?
Yeah, it's a fine balance. Our space, I like to say, we're not in the medical aesthetic specialty. We're in the confidence specialty, because when people feel good, they feel confident. Now, integrity is to not use that as a tactic to oversell a procedure or sell a procedure where the patient is not going to get the result that they envision. I'll give you an example. I had a patient come to me. She must have weighed close to 300 pounds, but she had done this very expensive, laser sculpting procedure at like a corporate medical spa franchise, and she spent about $5,000 doing this. Meanwhile, that procedure is for somebody that is very close to their ideal body weight. It's not for somebody that is obese. And so integrity for me in our scope is patient expectation, being honest with what they can experience, and also advising, saying the no's that I referenced earlier. Where if you think that somebody's, crossing a specific line where they're asking for a treatment that you don't think is in their best interest, to be able to say no and to turn that.
But how do I know? Out. I mean, I was at a place and actually somebody had bought me a facial treatment, so I went, and then the woman doing it, who also I guess does medical aesthetics, had said to me, I can make you look 10 years younger, and and I was like, younger than this? How is that even? No, I mean, it was a strange one for me, because how do I know whether the person is, I mean, first of all, there's a whole philosophical question of, do I want to look 10 years younger or whatever, but how do I know that this person is acting with integrity in that moment and being honest with me? Or, I mean, if I were in this business, that would be the easiest way to sell it, right? I can make you look 10 years younger, kid,
Exactly.
So how's the consumer to know?
Well, again, you got to do your research, and where we are right now with our practice, many of the patients are referred by others. So there's an automatic connection and trust.
By the way, can you tell I didn't take her up on it? Can you look at people? No, because I didn't. But can you look at people and go, he hasn't had this done yet, or I mean, is that?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean,
you should be able to tell, right?
I like to study faces and look at the facial expressions, and yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell I've had my nose enlarged? That's why it's so big. To take me back to how this all began for you, because first of all, I'm curious about your childhood in Iran. You grew up when you were a kid. You were a kid when the revolution happened in 1979. Right. You were in Iran. How would you describe your childhood in Iran?
In Iran, I grew up in for the first couple of years of my life, which I don't have a memory of really, but my parents were studying in Washington. So I spent between age, I want to say 1 to about 3 in Washington. And then the revolution happened. My dad's education was finished in the States. And so he went back to Iran. And of course, we went with him. And so then I spent between that time and roughly age 10 in Iran. Memories, I mean, like anyone else my age, I remember the beginnings of the war. I remember, driving from Tehran to Mashhad, where, to escape some of the aerial bombings that were over Tehran. And I, remember the feeling of vulnerability, for lack of a better word. I distinctly remember, on that drive, which may have been in the middle parts of the night, something happened to our car, and we were kind of stranded in the middle of the road. And, just Iran being what it is, especially at that time, there was a sense of belonging to anybody in that country. And so some stranger came in the middle of the night, and we weren't sure if it's a thief or it's somebody there to help us, but it was there somebody to help us, and helped us, get to our destination in Mashhad, where we spent a few weeks. And oddly enough, at about the same time, on our way back from Mashhad to Tehran, and again, I distinctly remember this, is the
This
first
is like you're
time.
6 years old, 7 years old?
Yeah, this will be, I believe I must have been around 8 or 9.
Okay.
But I distinctly remember that it was the first time that I felt something is not right with the joints in my body. All of a sudden, I'm 9 years old. I go from being an active soccer player, all this stuff, to wait a second, I can't move my elbows, I can't move my knees. My entire body feels heavy. What the heck is going on?
Yeah, this is an incredible part of your story. Before we get to that, do you come from a medical family? Are your parents?
I don't. No, they're entrepreneurs.
Huh. And you have a couple of brothers.
Mm-hmm.
What was life like with them as kids?
Yeah, I was the oldest sibling, and so our story as we came to Canada, and Canada in the 1980s was not as economically advanced as it is now, and so there was a struggle for my parents to settle in. So I was the oldest sibling, and being the oldest sibling, to some extent had a position of not quite like a parent, but kind of like a parent. And so I would characterize it as a responsibility at that age. Yeah.
Would anyone have guessed that you are going to grow up and become a successful doctor and entrepreneur?
Doctor, yeah. I mean, that was the thing to do, right? Like for us as first generation Iranians coming to Canada, myself, a lot of my friends, that was the thing to do. And
what about the entrepreneur celebrity Instagram guy?
probably not. Yeah, that came later. They don't teach you that in medical school. Yeah, they don't.
No,
teach you that
but I mean, I just wonder if as a kid you, if you were the guy setting up the lemonade stand, proverbially.
No, interestingly enough, I wasn't. I was more like kind of intellectual and academic. But even from my early years, I was I did a lot of teaching. I would teach after hours, like tutor other kids. And later on in medical school, I was teaching for a company called Kaplan. They had these MCAT courses. So people that had to take the MCAT exam to get into medical school, I was teaching the MCAT course for many summers. And some of that, kind of...
So it sounds like you've been an A-type personality for most of your life.
Yeah, goal-oriented for sure, yeah.
So let's get into the physical issues you had, because you end up coming to the West, the U.S. first,
yes,
when you're 10 years old in 1985, and you're suffering from this very ambiguous illness that basically crippled your arms and legs. You couldn't walk. You were in a wheelchair. That's a lot for a kid traveling from Iran to the West for the first time, or to live. That is.
Yeah.
What is your sense of that time in retrospect?
It's, at that age, somehow my experience was that you don't internalize the suffering. Like I almost feel that it must have been so much harder for my parents to observe that. And as we left Iran, in fact, the premise that we got the visa to the United States initially was to seek medical treatment. And so, at that time, they wouldn't give out visas easily to Iranians. And so, at the embassy, they said, okay, we're going to give a visa to you and your mom and your brothers, but we're not going to give a visa to your dad, because they didn't want, perhaps the family to settle there permanently. And so my dad ended up coming to Canada. We ended up in the U.S. in Los Angeles, and I wouldn't characterize it as a type of like suffering or tragedy. Somehow, at that age, I was kind of rolling with the punches to a certain extent.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you feel different?
Yes, different. Yes, no question. Yeah, different. Yes,
But you didn't. Sounds like you didn't see yourself as a victim somehow.
not at the time. Maybe because I felt that this is temporary, or we're gonna find some type of a solution out of it. But I do remember, if when I go back in the memory bank, there was an instance at that time when we were in Los Angeles, and I was just beginning treatment. So essentially, I was still, in a wheelchair. And
sorry, you couldn't move your arms and
couldn't
legs?
move. No. I had a condition called juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. So this is not the old age arthritis. It's rheumatoid arthritis is an inflammatory condition. And you can get it in adulthood or you can get it in childhood. I had the childhood version. And so that results in severe inflammation. Like my knee was twice the size of a normal knee, my elbow. Yeah.
And by the way, no one would forgive a 10-year-old for being frustrated or angry or any of those emotions that if you did have those,
Not that I remember, I can, talk to my parents about it, but it just maybe felt temporary somehow. And maybe, at that time, maybe a little bit just my, as you said, kind of like intellectual mindset. Like my brain was engaged regardless. I wasn't someone that felt like if I'm not playing soccer, I'm, missing out on everything. But I do remember, there was one night, one of my uncles who's passed away now, but we were at his home in Beverly Hills, and his home was 2 stories. And so we were spending the night there, and obviously I could not, get up the steps. And I remember my uncle, carrying me, and I was feeling like, oh my God, I'm 9 years old and I can't even get up the stairs on my own. So there were some memories like that, but there was an optimism there, where it was coming from. I don't know. And I think it must have been much harder for my parents.
You also have a memory at your uncle's house in LA. I don't know if it's the same uncle, of the first time after a year and a half that you could walk without pain.
Yeah, that's a different uncle.
Different uncle.
So this is the uncle in Santa Monica, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I remember spending a night there, and this is now like 9-10 months after treatment, high dosages of anti-inflammatories, physiotherapy every day to build up my muscles, and so eventually going from wheelchair to crutches, and then from crutches to walking. But even when I did start to walk on my own, there was always this feeling of like heaviness, as if your body is being pulled into the floor. And I distinctly remember just getting up in the morning, spending the night at my uncle's house, and waking up and taking the first few steps, and it was like, wow. Like, it's over. Yeah.
And we should do a shout out to is it Dr. Darvish, who was the...
Yeah. At that time when we came to Los Angeles, there was a prominent rheumatologist. His name was Dr. Darvish. And I remember his face still, even though some of my childhood memories are not very clear. I remember that he had a Porsche that he would drive to the medical building, and he was a great guy. Yeah, so he really made the diagnosis, put me on the right medications, and then I heard years later he passed away at a relatively young age. But he definitely made an impact.
So how did all of that the experience of having these issues with your own body, and then the experience of having a doctor help you return to yourself and go from the wheelchair to the crutches to walking again. How did that experience shape your interest or desire to get into medicine?
It definitely had an impact. It was a very personal experience. I interacted a lot with doctors even after I got well, but it was kind of like a maintenance that I had to undergo for a number of years. So I had a lot of interactions with the healthcare system, and it definitely made an impact. And on top of that, again, being first generation Iranian in a new country, that was kind of, in some ways, your path to a better life. And so my friends, I remember all my high school friends, they all became, involved in healthcare. They all became prominent surgeons, physicians, dentists. And looking back, one of the huge things that I was thinking the other day really shaped who I am was that group of friends, right? Going to high school here in Toronto, having a bunch of goal-oriented, driven high school friends who were pushing each other, sometimes competing, because Iranians, we like to be a little bit solo, so we have to always end up on top. And so that drive, the competition. I remember one of my friends who's now an orthopedic surgeon in Florida, but we were just compete on everything as far as academia went.
But you were fortunate as well that you had a community. When you're one of these guys I'm jealous of, because some of us came here and didn't, felt like odd ducks because we were Persian and there was nobody around for miles that spoke Farsi or we could, intimately identify with. You, at the age of 10, go to LA, and from what I understand, you don't speak English very well at all, or at all, right?
No.
But you go for the first year without even speaking English because you're in LA, and even at that point in LA, there's a Persian community, yes?
Oh, yes, huge, Tehran jealous, right? As opposed to Tehran too.
Right.
But I remember I spent almost a year in public school in Los Angeles, and I could not speak a word of English because there was 4 other Iranian kids in my class and they were translating everything. But then we spent 3 months in Atlanta, Georgia with another uncle of mine. And in those 3 months, I learned more than the entire year in LA, because at that time in Atlanta, it was all, blonde hair and blue-eyed kids that I had to go to school with. And that's when I really started to learn English.
I want to do a bit of a sidebar here of how you look. I mean, you're born in Iran. Your formative years are there. But there's a lot of folks who came here at the age of 10, to the West, that is, who don't necessarily maintain extremely strong ties to the Iranian community or to the country of their birth, etc. You really do. And one of the ways that you say you not only a big part of forming your identity, but retaining your identity once you came to Canada was Iranian pop music, the stuff that was being made in LA in the 80s. Tell me about seeing Andy and Kuros in the 1980s.
Yeah, I remember it well. Sometimes those concerts at the Harbor Castle, I think, Westin Harbor Castle Hotel. Yeah, I think that if the Iranian Los Angeles-based pop music was not there, then many people of my generation would not have developed certain aspects of their Iranian identity, and that's why, any chance that I get, I love supporting Iranian artists, musicians.
You do, yeah.
And in fact, last year...
That's why we have Andy to thank for that you...
Yes, you do. And, I'll give you a funny story. Every time we go to Los Angeles with my wife, we always go to Cabaret Tehran. I think it's called the House of Legends now. And the founder of Cabaret Tehran, I believe he's a great guy. I believe he must be in his 70s, if not more now. Mr. Ahmad Masood, I think it is. Last time I was there, this conversation me and you are having, I told him the same thing. I said, if it wasn't for Cabaret Tehran and what Cabaret Tehran did, supporting all those Los Angeles-based Iranian artists, maybe today I wouldn't have, this Persian identity that I do.
But what I actually kind of love about that is it's a little counterintuitive, because sometimes we think of, and all due respect to them, of course, but we think of that LA 80s Iranian pop as, the kind of cheesy stuff or light, a disposable pop, etc. Even if it's songs that people remember and sing along, they remember from their childhood or whatever it was. But this formed the spine of this was really important to you in terms of a cultural flashpoint that kept you in touch with being Iranian.
100%. Just it helped with that identity. Now you had a concert to go to with your friends, and I remember Again, first generation Iranians. The first time I wanted to go, I think it was a Shahram Shapare club concert in Toronto. And my cousin was like the promoter. So I had got tickets. And, us first generation Iranians, we had it much harder than our siblings. And I remember I got back home late that night from the concert. Might have been like 1:30, 2 a.m.
You mean harder than your younger siblings, right?
Than my younger siblings, sorry.
They got an easier pass.
Yeah, exactly. So I, get back home at like 1:30 in the morning. And the next day, my dad was literally threatening to close his suitcases and move the entire family back to Iran because it was an adjustment for them, right? Meanwhile, my younger siblings, once they went through their teenage years,
Right.
My parents would have been very happy
Your
if they
dad
were
was
home at 1:30.
blaming poor Shahram Shahbaz
Yes,
for all
that's right.
all your hooliganism.
Yeah.
So somewhere in and around all of this, you end up choosing medicine, and we've talked a little bit about the passion that you felt for medicine for personal reasons, what you went through, etc. But I do wonder about the emphasis on higher education, the middle upper class Persian thing. You talked about your friends being successful surgeons or people who work in the healthcare field now. You see that as a blessing. Could it also be too much pressure to conform or succeed in a certain field? I mean, was it really an option for you, or did you feel like you had to do this and we got lucky because you're so passionate about it?
Yeah, I don't think I had to do it. I think I had other options. But, looking back, I think you have to be careful with the pursuit of higher education because education can be a business in its own right. And so if you're not goal-oriented and if you're not following a specific path, you can end up almost being on a hamster wheel and not getting to your destination. So when I have younger patients in the office and we, during the treatment, maybe we're chatting about career choices, education, my viewpoint on it is, of course, quite different than perhaps the way it would have been with my parents. And in fact, as somebody who spent a decade in the education system, I have to say that you have to really choose carefully and do your research and know what you're getting into. I find still, many people get into career paths without ever spending a day, in that environment. So I tell them, if you want to be, in healthcare, if you want to be in medicine, dentistry, even if you're spending a month being the secretary in an office, you're going to get a lot of information, whether this is your calling or not. So that's very, very important.
So when one of your future kids says, Dad, I just want to be a backup singer in a band, that's for my career, you're going to be okay with that?
Yeah, the short answer would be yes. I think that the education system overall actually does not do a good job teaching the really valuable skills. So what are the really valuable skills? Being able to do public speaking, being creative, innovative. So if they want to be the backup singer, well, they might have to also know how to manage their finances, how to brand themselves, how to innovate within their field. So I've learned just as much, if not more, from self-education as opposed to traditional education.
I feel like that's I'd like to think that was an honest answer, but I feel like there still may be a conversation that happens in there with the kid that it's like, but you could take over Skin Beauty MD in a few years.
No, Gian, it's not. You'd be surprised. A lot of physicians, a lot of dentists, just as many of them will actually advise their kids against it as they would for it. Yeah,
that's actually interesting.
Yeah.
It's like actors saying, "I don't want my kid to be an
Exactly.
actor." That's the anything but be, If you know the insides.
Exactly.
Of it.
If you know the insides and if you know some of the challenges, I think it's more important, for what you're doing to match your inner calling. And maybe for me, the inner calling to help with rejuvenation, help with people's confidence, beauty, aesthetics, that was there, and I geared my medical career that way. Now, medicine, the one nice thing about medicine is there's so many different specialties. So let's say if somebody's more technology oriented, well, now they might go into something like interventional radiology as an example. If somebody doesn't want to talk to people, well, they could go into pathology and look at, microscopes. But I know what you mean. In fact, coming in for this interview, I was thinking, oh my God, I'm getting this cough and, I'm going to have to clear my throat.
Why didn't I go into pathology?
Yeah, exactly. And, how does Gian, pull off all these interviews every week? This is so hard. So yes, once you're in it, then you have a different inside knowledge.
Well, let's talk about the decision you made, because you probably wouldn't be here if you had chosen to go into, maybe you would be, but it is the path that you've taken in medicine that has led you to become known, and one of the reasons you're here. This decision in 2006 to go from primary care as the primary thing you do to medical aesthetics. What precipitated that decision?
A few things. Interestingly enough, probably the first thing was my experience as a patient. So I was in my late 20s and I always still had persistent acne. So I would never have clear skin. So finally here I am. I've finished medical school, finished residency, and I finally have the time to go see a physician to take care of this acne. And so I remember he put me on Accutane, which is a 6-month course of medication. And then after the Accutane, I did 3.
It's an oral thing.
It's an oral, yeah. It's pretty heavy. After the 6 months, I did 3 courses of laser treatments, which at the time were quite pricey for the time. It was like $5,000 back in 2006. But I distinctly remember what a positive interaction it was for me as a patient, and like how grateful I was that I had done this and he had helped me through this. So that kind of formed the genesis for me, because it was important for me to do something impactful. And once I felt how impactful that journey for me as a patient was.
You literally felt the difference of what it feels like to have your face
absolutely.
Cleaned, fit your face reformed somehow.
Exactly. And it was, oddly enough, a doctor in Barrie. And again, I distinctly remember the encounter as well. And there's lots of other medical encounters which you won't remember, but because it was impactful, I remember it. I remember the laser procedures. And that formed the genesis. And shortly after that is when I first started to attend some of the medical aesthetics conferences. And I really had to make a decision, because I was also an associate physician in a primary care clinic at the time. And the primary care clinic had basically come up for sale. So I could essentially be an owner or a co-owner. And that was an easier path, honestly, at the time. But I made the decision, I'm going to follow my passion, even though I had to start from the ground level.
And then maybe I've got some stereotypes about what medical aesthetics is, but isn't trying to cure some acne different from Botox? Isn't it a different mission?
Well, remember our practice, medical aesthetics, Botox was the genesis procedure, and most people come into a medical aesthetics practice through that. But we do lots of other things, including using, fillers to improve skin texture, skin quality, some acne management as well I do in the practice. But I would categorize them as all in the same, scope. You're improving your appearance, you're improving your aesthetics. Because if you've got, let's say, as you're interviewing me here, if you've got a deep frown line, it will impact.
Do I?
No, it will impact the emotion that you're portraying. And I remember listening to actually an interview that you did on the Roqe platform with the famous Iranian-based surgeon, Dr. Sheila Nazaria.
Yes.
And she said something that really stuck with me.
In Beverly Hills in
LA.
Yeah,
Exactly. And she's so well-spoken too. She said, a lot of times people don't do a cosmetic procedure to look different, but rather they do it to look more similar to the perception of themselves.
Find themselves. Yes.
And so if you are 65, but you feel like you're 50, you're fit, you're healthy, you're vibrant, you're aware of everything that's going on in the world, well, why wouldn't you want your face to reflect that vitality? And it may surprise you. Our oldest patient, I love saying this, is 92 years old. Now, imagine how resilient you have to be to come for
Man
Botox.
or a woman?
It's a woman, Italian woman.
What does the 92-year-old woman get done?
Botox and a little bit of filler, yeah. And but we have many more patients than you could imagine in their 70s and 80s. But they're all of a specific type. They're usually in good shape physically. They walk with a nice tall posture. They're well dressed to the point where when I go into the room, I have to double check my posture so I don't look older than this, patient who's there in their 70s and 80s. Psychologically very resilient, very curious about the world. In fact, there's one that, every time she comes in, we have the most engaging, conversations about the world. She always recommends good books for me to read. You don't necessarily see that type of a patient in a medical practice because by definition, patients that frequent medical practice more are often obviously experiencing some type of, pathology, sometimes psychological issues, other things.
But are they usually wealthy? I mean, the 92-year-old, I'm assuming she's not a pensioner if she's coming to you and getting, which is a big part of the discussion around the kind of work you do is it's not really accessible to everybody, is it?
Well, I would argue against that. In fact, I can give you a specific example. That 92-year-old, she's retired, and her husband was a Italian hairstylist. This is probably before the days where hairstylists were celebrities in their own right, as well. And so, no, it was a very reasonable means. No, I think the services, and that's part of the beauty of medical aesthetics, is that it is accessible to pretty much everybody. I once did a interview where we talked about the amount of money that women spend on just makeup products, right? But if you prioritize certain other things like the cosmetic injections, well, maybe now you don't need that, expensive makeup product or that, expensive clothing that makes you look, slim because, your face looks the way that you want it to look. So I think in life, it's always a matter of priority.
What if somebody comes in and really wants a procedure and you think it'd be great for them and they don't have do you have some sort of, I don't want to out you here so that you have to offer deals to people, but do you work with them somehow? I mean,
sometimes, if I really feel like somebody needs a procedure and if things are really, really in a situation that they can't make it work, they sometimes come as models for our teaching programs. Where there's a will, there's a way. We're not talking about thousands and thousands of dollars by any means. And occasionally, I'll tell someone, this is the impact the procedure would have. Come and see us when things are better because, again, you need a goal to aspire to.
Let me take a couple of steps back because we're talking about you as a successful clinic owner and founder, et cetera. But it wasn't a super easy path to get here. You back in 2006, as you've said, you choose to open your own clinic. You didn't have to do that, but that takes some gumption. And it occurs to me that I think you said it earlier. The entrepreneurial part is not what you've actually gone to medical school for, right?
No.
So tell me about the difference between medical training and business training and how you got up to speed on the business part.
I was forced into it, I think that is one of the deficiencies of the educational system. Even if you're not in medicine, like I interviewed somebody who was coming to our clinic to look at a digital marketing position, and they had recently graduated from a university, I won't say which one, in Ontario. And I was just dumbfounded by how little they knew about, digital marketing. And
U of T.
No, actually. And so, university tends to lag behind, right? And so unless, you're really, as I said, goal-oriented and strategic about it, and you're seeking out those opportunities to augment what you're learning from the textbooks with real-life practice. And so medical school maybe is the worst example of this because it can be so one-dimensional in scope. And I think the educational system needs a lot revamp.
So in your
stages.
case, you open a business and you don't know
I had no idea what I was doing.
Right.
I had no idea what I was doing. Yeah.
And how did that manifest itself then? I mean, I know you've said you had some difficult years at the beginning of the practice getting things going. What was the nature of that? And what did you tell yourself in terms of persevering and having faith that you could build this thing?
Yeah, as I said, there was a vision, but challenge and difficulty may be an understatement. It was pretty hard. And in the first few years, there were times that I was doing both the medical aesthetics and I was working elsewhere as a physician to allow for things to continue and for us to build up. So, yeah, to call it a challenge was an understatement. But I'll tell you one thing, looking back, patience helped me, being patient, having the attribute of being patient. But one thing I learned, this is now more in the entrepreneurial realm, is that actually being too patient can be a major weakness in an entrepreneur.
So what's an example of how impatience helped you?
Well, I'm just, much quicker with my decision making now. And if something is not working, I don't identify with it. So you're just so slow.
And also the point being, if it's not working, know when to hold them, know when to fold them, as the old song would say. But that's a tough one because the gurus of this kind of thing, I mean, we've had a couple of them on the show, of Iranian background, yes. Dr. Ali Parsa, Hadi Partovi. The mantra of a startup, the mantra of a new business, et cetera, is perseverance. Keep going. It's don't expect things too fast. So
I disagree with that.
You do?
I do. So there's this concept in the startup world, MVP, minimal viable product. So when I, look at certain projects and, I'm an avid reader of, business enterprises and startups and everything, I see so many of them that they try to perfect something, whereas you got to have your MVP, your minimal viable product, and from there you move on and you decide if it's the right path, and if it is, you look at ways to scale up there.
What was the turning point, or what was the moment that you knew, bingo, I've got success, this is turning into something now?
The turning point, I don't know if I can, there's that saying, which I guess in this application would be the reverse. There's a saying in the business world, which is, how did you go bankrupt? And the person says, slowly, then all at once, right? Because things happen slowly and then you find yourself, oh my God, where am I? Now that can work in reverse as well. So the successes were building slowly and then they hit a critical threshold. And in my case, it was like just put my head down and sheer willpower. But I don't recommend that path. I think, that's kind of the, first generation Iranian mentality. And that's kind of growing up in high school and being an academic and being a bookworm.
I mean, did you have people around you, maybe medical friends of yours who didn't go into the medical aesthetics, say, hey, come on, man, why don't you get back to primary practice? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when I evaluate myself, and I think part of learning is to evaluate yourself, I was somebody who was very sensitive to doing what I truly loved, okay? But I had colleagues that were not as sensitive to that. They were much more practical. So for them, it was more like, I'm going to do 10, 15 years doing something I don't love, but then, that's giving me the resources later on to do something that I love. Both paths can work. And I don't want people to discount. You see, people tell you do what you love, but they don't tell you the second part, that it can be extremely hard to make doing what you love a successful, financially viable enterprise.
You referenced Dr. Sheila Nazarian earlier, talking about people who get work done, feeling like they're actually finding themselves more. Right. Going back to who I really am by getting these injections done, etc. You've said something really interesting around this, which is that it's your observation that the stereotype or the orthodox thought is that people do this for the sake of others, for some audience that is going to look at them, or to be more attractive to others who are. But your observation is people actually do this for themselves, for how they feel when they look in the mirror. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. I think we had a beautiful laboratory experiment with everything that happened with the pandemic, because here's the pandemic, and especially our experience in Ontario with, the long shutdowns. I was myself surprised at the level of demand that there was for medical aesthetics procedures, even during the pandemic. So every time, like if we were closed for a short period of time, every time we reopened, there was like double the demand, even though people were not going to like social functions. They were working often remotely from home.
It's interesting, huh?
Yes.
They still wanted
to do it. So that to me proved how much of a internal inner thing it is. It's how you feel when you get up in the morning, and you want how you look to match how you feel.
When you feel like somebody has unrealistic expectations, when somebody says, "Gian, your face has gotten topoli," I mean, it's like maybe I should eat less KFC, or go to the gym more. Like it's not only things that you can necessarily solve, right?
Exactly.
In the Skin Beauty MD clinic. So do you talk them through that? I mean, as a doctor, do you sort of go, you should probably hit the gym a few times a week or something like that?
Yeah, I think when they're there for a specific goal, it's pretty simple. Either we can deliver that goal to them, or we can't. And you have to be a little bit careful with saying some of the peripheral things, because imagine if you're somebody that you are overweight because you're on medications as a side effect, right? Like it's not as simple as that,
sure.
Right? Or imagine if you're somebody, and this happens frequently, or I should say it's not uncommon for it to happen, where you look beautiful and young and amazing, but you're depressed, and your depression sees everything bad, both the world and yourself. Now, you might think it's simple enough for me to tell somebody you're having clinical depression, and so your assessment of yourself is not accurate. But I've learned through experience that's actually a tough conversation to have. So, I might have some...
Because it's not your gig?
It's not your gig, and yes, they might think, rightly or wrongly, that they're being judged, and so you have to be careful about that, because it's a limited scope of an interaction.
Right.
And then if somebody does have clinical depression, they could also be more sensitive, more irritable. And I pride myself a little bit in that I'm very good at that, right? So if I talk with someone for a few minutes, most of the time I can get a sense of what else is going on through the words that they use, through the expressions that they have.
A big part of what you do is there is a real marketing aspect to it. We were at the same dinner, and I saw that somebody recognized you, or somebody said, and there was a group of people, and they all looked you up on Instagram and started following you. That's not something that somebody does with the most doctors or surgeons.
That's right.
Is that taxing on you? Do you enjoy doing that? Do you have to now spend time on social media, in between being a doctor? I mean, that's another thing you wouldn't have learned in medical school.
That's right. You definitely don't learn that. Yes, to answer your question, it is taxing. I had a friend of mine who's a prominent builder, and he came up to me at one of these functions, and he said, I love some of the messaging in your Instagram posts and stories, and it's so positive. And I looked at him and I said, sometimes I envy your work, because you don't have to do the social media marketing. It can be very taxing. The Instagram algorithm, YouTube algorithm, they're ruthless. If you're not putting out good quality content, they won't put it in the face of people that want to see it.
You live in Toronto. How come? Why haven't you moved to the States like a lot of rich doctors do, where they can get richer?
Well, this is a dinner conversation. My wife has been on my case for the last number of months, in particular because we had such a harsh winter in Toronto. Gian, I don't have a good answer to that. All I can say...
You don't have a good answer.
You don't have a
Your
good
answer's
answer
supposed to be
that.
Canada. I love Canada. The maple leaf. I mean,
Well, I'm going to tell you.
Diversity.
I feel that actually Canada is experiencing a brain drain. And I think it's much more significant than people realize. And I think, in fact, I had this conversation with a federal member of parliament that what is Canada's brand other than cultural diversity, right? If we look at Canada as a company, what is the brand? Why does it have to be just, the cultural diversity, or let's say an advocate for peace? Why are we not celebrating, Canada as a technology incubator? Even as a tourist destination, certain parts of Canada are just beautiful,
sure.
right? Like
Yeah.
whenever I go to Montreal, I'm like, why? Like Montreal is just one of the best places in North America to visit in the summertime. But why is it so low key? Why do you go in the United States and so few people from the States have come up to experience Montreal, experience Toronto, experience Vancouver? Where is the brand? But Feridun Moshiri has a poem, the famous Persian poet, Man inja rishe dar khakam. And so sometimes, even in the middle of a Canadian winter storm, as
Your Risha is Dar Khak.
Dar Khak, yeah, and I'm like, I don't know what I love about this place, but I'm going down Yonge Street, and of course, by every February, you want to move, and then the weather starts to get better, and you're like, you know what, this is one heck of a nice city.
Well, you have to keep your partner happy too. If she's, you're gonna have to. You might lose the debate at some point, which would be sad because we'd hate to lose you from Toronto, but gain you in another place. The Persian community has grown shockingly, exponentially, massively in the last decade, 15 years in Toronto. Strangely enough, pretty much in and around where your clinic is in Toronto. Has that been good for business? I can guess.
Yes, it has been good, no question. When a business is more mature like ours is, it's less dependent on a specific niche of clients. But that can be a double-edged sword as well, because it can keep you too narrow in your comfort zone. Whereas the US is that big melting pot where that traditional, cultural identity diffuses into, something that's more of a blank state, and you go from that blank state.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you. You didn't cough once. Or maybe you did cough once, but your greatest fears were not realized. There was very little coughing. A couple of general questions before I let you go, and I thank you so much for the time you've given us. What's the hardest part of what you do?
The hardest part is the business aspect, for sure. A lot of the things that happen behind the scenes, to be able to be in a position to have patients come into the office and get the treatments that they like. So that would be the first part. The second part, I think, would be, managing patient expectations. And I'm really skilled at that, but occasionally, despite the fact that I'm skilled at it, I sometimes read an individual incorrectly with their goals and what they have in mind, and then they surprise me. It happens to me now maybe once a year, but it still happens. And so I think that's the second part.
And finally, what are you most proud of these days?
Well, these days, I'm most proud of being resilient, being able to be involved in this industry. We alluded to it earlier, from a position of high integrity. A lot of opportunities have come into my life which may have resulted in shortcuts or maybe temporary success. But some of the decisions I'm most proud of are that, I stuck with ethics and a high standard, and sometimes it was at personal loss, but I stuck with my ethics. But lastly speaking, I'm going to a different phase of life, and my wife is pregnant, a son to be born, and so that's a whole new perspective on everything. And I'm sure if you ask me this question in the future, the answer would have something to do with the birth of this child.
It's great to have you here. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Amir Rouzati, founder and director of Skin Beauty MD. He's been with me in the Roqe studio today.